Jonas stood at the edge of a dusty battlefield, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows over the desolate landscape. His heart raced, adrenaline coursing through his veins as he surveyed the chaos unfolding before him. Gunfire crackled in the distance, punctuated by the anguished cries of those in distress. He could see a young woman trapped beneath the rubble of a collapsed building, her screams piercing the air like arrows. Without a moment's hesitation, Jonas sprinted toward her, his military training kicking in as he assessed the situation. "Hang on," he shouted, his voice steady despite the turmoil around him. "I'm coming for you." The woman looked up, terror etched across her face as she struggled to free herself. Jonas reached her side, his hands already working to clear the debris. The weight of the concrete slab was immense, but he grunted with effort, fueled by a fierce determination to save her. With each heave, he could feel his muscles straining, but he pressed on, the urgency of the moment driving him forward. "Please, hurry," she cried, her voice trembling. "I can't breathe." Jonas gritted his teeth, summoning every ounce of strength he had left. "Just a little longer," he urged, feeling the sweat trickle down his brow. Finally, with a final push, he managed to lift the slab just enough for her to wriggle free. She gasped for air as he pulled her into his arms, relief flooding over them both. "You're safe now," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the din of warfare. He could feel her trembling against him, and his heart swelled with pride at having made a difference, even in such dire circumstances. As the scene faded, Jonas found himself standing in a much different setting. A military hall adorned with flags and medals, the air heavy with the scent of polished wood and freshly pressed uniforms. It was his retirement ceremony, a moment he had both anticipated and dreaded. Rows of fellow soldiers and dignitaries applauded, their faces beaming with pride. Jonas forced a smile, but inside, he felt like a ghost, drifting through a life that no longer felt like his own. "Jonas Carter," the commanding officer announced, his voice booming through the hall. "For bravery above and beyond the call of duty, we honor you today." Jonas stepped forward to accept the accolades, the clinking of medals against his chest echoing in his ears. As he shook hands and exchanged pleasantries, he felt disconnected, as if he were watching someone else accept the honors. They praised him for his courage, but there was an emptiness inside him, a void left by the loss of purpose. "Congratulations, Sergeant," a fellow soldier said, clapping him on the back. "You deserve every bit of this." "Thanks," Jonas replied, forcing a smile. "But it feels strange, you know? Like I'm not ready for this chapter to end." The soldier nodded in understanding, but Jonas could see that most of them were moving on, eager to celebrate his achievements. The applause echoed in his mind long after the ceremony ended, leaving him with a lingering sense of loneliness. Days turned into weeks, and Jonas found himself navigating a new reality as an Uber driver. The hum of the city filled his ears as he drove, each passenger a fleeting connection in a world that felt increasingly isolating. He often glanced in the rearview mirror, searching for a glimpse of his own reflection, but all he saw was a man struggling to find his place. "Where to?" he asked one afternoon, a weary businessman settling into the back seat. "Just downtown, please," the man replied, eyes glued to his phone. As Jonas drove, he reflected on his past, the thrill of combat, the camaraderie with his brothers in arms, and the thrill of saving lives. Now, he felt like a shadow of his former self, a man defined by the scars he bore, both visible and hidden. The conversations in the car were often trivial, and he longed for someone to see beyond the surface, to acknowledge the weight of his experiences. "Thanks for the ride," the businessman said, tossing a few bills onto the seat as he exited. "Take care," Jonas murmured, watching the man disappear into the bustling crowd. The emptiness returned, a familiar ache echoing in his chest. He was just a driver now, a fleeting presence in the lives of others, a far cry from the hero he once was. As he pulled away from the curb, Jonas couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. Life had a way of throwing unexpected challenges his way, and he was ready, whether he knew it or not. But for now, the road stretched ahead, and he continued to drive, seeking a destination that felt just out of reach. Jonas pulled up to the curb, glancing at the passenger waiting with a scowl etched on his face. Ricardo was a young man, perhaps in his mid-20s, with a disheveled appearance and an air of aggression that made Jonas's instincts flare. He could feel the tension vibrating in the air as the young man climbed into the back seat, his movements sharp and deliberate. "Where to?" Jonas asked, attempting to keep his tone neutral, despite the unease settling in his stomach. "Just drive," Ricardo snapped, rolling his eyes as if Jonas were nothing more than a glorified chauffeur. Jonas nodded, shifting the car into gear and pulling away from the curb. The ride was silent for a moment, but it didn't take long for Ricardo to break the tension. "You know, I don't get why they let people like you drive around. You could be a criminal or something," he muttered, his voice dripping with contempt. Jonas clenched his jaw, the familiar sting of prejudice washing over him. He swallowed hard, reminding himself that he was just there to do a job. "I'm just an Uber driver, man. Just trying to make a living," he replied, keeping his voice steady. Ricardo huffed, leaning forward slightly as if to punctuate his disdain. "Yeah, right. I bet you think you're some kind of hero, huh? Just because you wear that uniform. You're all the same," he continued, his words laced with venom. Jonas's patience wore thin. "I didn't wear the uniform to be a hero. I wore it to serve my country, to protect people like you." His voice remained calm, but the weight of his past hung heavy in the air. "Protect people like me? Is that a joke?" Ricardo scoffed. "You're just a loser pretending to be something you're not. You think just because you fought in some war, you deserve respect? You don't deserve anything. You're just a thug." Jonas gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white. "I'm not a thug, and you should watch your mouth. I'm just trying to do my job here." Ricardo's expression twisted into a sneer. "Or maybe you're just trying to kidnap me. How do I know you're not going to take me somewhere and—" He paused for dramatic effect, his eyes narrowing. "Do something crazy?" The accusation hung in the air like a loaded gun, and Jonas felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. "Kidnap you? Are you serious? I'm driving you to your destination. You're the one being hostile here." "Sure, whatever you say," Ricardo replied, pulling out his phone, his fingers flying over the screen. "I'm calling the cops. I'm being kidnapped. This is insane." "What?" Jonas exclaimed, his heart racing as he realized the gravity of the situation. "You can't be serious. This is ridiculous." Ricardo smirked, his bravado returning as he pressed the call button. "Let's see how they feel about you then. Maybe they'll lock you up where you belong." Jonas's mind raced. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, the fight-or-flight instinct kicking in. "You're making a huge mistake," he warned, trying to stay calm while his heart pounded in his ears. "This isn't going to end well for you." "Oh, I'm counting on it," Ricardo said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "You think you can just intimidate me? You've got another thing coming." The sirens wailed in the distance, and Jonas's heart dropped. The reality of the situation began to sink in. He was a black man behind the wheel with a young white man falsely accusing him of kidnapping. His mind raced, considering the implications, the possibility of violence, and the misunderstanding that could spiral out of control in an instant. "Just calm down," Jonas said, his voice steadying despite the storm of emotions within him. "I'm not your enemy. I'm just trying to get you where you want to go." Ricardo continued to speak into the phone, his voice loud and triumphant. "Yeah, I'm in an Uber, and the driver is threatening me. The words hung in the air, a heavy weight of accusation that threatened to unravel everything. Jonas took a deep breath, fighting against the rising tide of despair. He had fought for his country, faced enemies in war, and now he was being painted as the villain in a scenario that seemed straight out of a nightmare. As the sirens drew closer, Jonas realized that he needed to find a way to stay calm, to hold on to his dignity, and to confront the darkness that was now swirling around him. As the wail of sirens pierced the air, Jonas felt his heart race, a stark contrast to the calm he had fought to maintain. Police cars surrounded his vehicle, their flashing lights a cacophony of red and blue that reflected in the rearview mirror. Panic surged within him. This was a nightmare scenario he had never anticipated as an Uber driver. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to steady his breathing. Stay calm, he muttered under his breath, reminding himself that he was not a threat. In the back seat, Ricardo's bravado faltered as the seriousness of the situation dawned on him. His bravado had led him here. But now, with the police closing in, a sliver of fear crept into his expression. He glanced at Jonas, and for the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. "What did you do, man?" he hissed, his voice tinged with both accusation and fear. "I didn't do anything," Jonas replied, his voice steady yet low, a deliberate attempt to diffuse the tension. "This is a misunderstanding." He kept his eyes forward, watching as police officers exited their vehicles, hands hovering near their holstered weapons, ready for any sign of trouble. He felt the weight of their scrutiny, the implications of Ricardo's earlier actions hanging heavily in the air. A female officer approached the driver's side, her expression firm yet scrutinizing. As she drew closer, Jonas could see the recognition flicker in her eyes. "Jonas?" she asked, disbelief coloring her tone. "Is that you?" "Yes, officer," he replied, trying to project calm even as his heart raced. The recognition in her eyes brought a glimmer of hope, a sliver of familiarity amidst the chaos. "I'm just an Uber driver. This is a misunderstanding." The officer's demeanor shifted as she processed his words. "Ricardo, is it?" She turned her attention to the young man in the back seat, who was now fidgeting nervously, his earlier confidence evaporating. "You called in a kidnapping?" Ricardo blinked rapidly, confusion washing over him. I thought he was trying to take me somewhere against my will," he stammered. But the conviction in his voice faltered under the weight of the officer's gaze. "Jonas is a hero," the officer continued, her voice firm yet softer now. "He saved a woman's life in combat. He's not a kidnapper." She paused, letting the gravity of her words sink in. "You really don't know, do you?" "What are you talking about?" Ricardo replied, disbelief evident in his tone, but a hint of worry began to seep through his bravado. The officer took a step back, her posture relaxing slightly as she prepared to explain. "Years ago, Jonas risked his life to save a civilian during a hostile operation. That civilian was," she hesitated, gauging Ricardo's reaction, "your mother." The revelation hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating. Jonas watched as Ricardo's face paled, his arrogance replaced by shock. "My mother," he echoed, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, that can't be right." "It is," the officer affirmed, her tone unyielding. She spoke about him, about how he saved her. She never forgot what he did. "You really have no idea what you just did?" Jonas felt a whirlwind of emotions as he observed Ricardo's struggle to process the information. He saw the young man's defenses crumbling, layer by layer. The humiliation and anger that had fueled Ricardo's actions now merged with confusion and fear, leaving him vulnerable. "Are you serious?" Ricardo's voice trembled, disbelief evident in his eyes. "You're telling me he's the guy? The one who saved her?" "Yes," the officer replied, her words heavy with meaning. "You need to understand the gravity of your actions. You accused him of something terrible, something he didn't do. You've disrespected a man who risked everything for your family." Jonas felt a strange mix of vindication and sadness. This confrontation had taken a turn he had never expected. As the pieces started to connect in Ricardo's mind, he could see the young man grappling with the weight of his own prejudices, the walls he had built around himself beginning to crack. "Wait," Ricardo said, his voice faltering. I didn't know. I didn't mean." His words trailed off, the realization of his actions washing over him like a tidal wave, leaving him disoriented. The officer stood firm, her eyes locked onto Ricardo's, conveying the importance of accountability. "Now it's time to think about what you've done," she said softly, but firmly. "This isn't just a misunderstanding anymore. It's about understanding who you are and who he is." The air was thick with tension and the weight of unspoken words. Jonas remained silent, letting the moment linger, feeling the gravity of the situation shift. The confrontation had opened a door, one that might lead to understanding or further conflict. As the tension in the air thickened, Ricardo's face drained of color, his mind racing to connect dots he had never bothered to consider before. He stared at Jonas, a mix of fear and disbelief swirling in his eyes. The realization hit him like a freight train. The woman Jonas had saved during that military operation, the one whose story he had heard from his mother countless times, was none other than his own parent. Memories flooded back, fragments of conversations where his mother had recounted the heroism of a soldier who had risked his life for her. The tales she had spun, colored with admiration and gratitude, now had a face: Jonas. "Wait, you're the one," Ricardo stammered, his voice barely above a whisper, his bravado crumbling into a heap of shame. "You saved my mom." Jonas met his gaze with a calm intensity, the weight of the moment settling heavily between them. "That's right. I didn't do it for accolades or recognition. I did it because it was the right thing to do," he replied, his voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of pain. "Your mother was brave too. She was in a situation that no one should ever face." "God, I didn't know," Ricardo murmured, his hands trembling on his knees. He had spent the entire ride flinging insults and accusations, blinded by his prejudice, and now he was confronted with the reality of his ignorance. I was just so angry." "Anger doesn't justify hatred," Jonas responded, his tone firm yet understanding. "You didn't know me. You didn't know my story. And you certainly didn't know the sacrifices that many people, including myself, have made to keep you and your family safe." The police officer, still observing the interaction, took a step closer, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. "This isn't just about you two anymore," she interjected, her voice steady but compassionate. "It's about recognizing the harm that's been done and finding a way to understand each other." Ricardo swallowed hard, the lump in his throat growing as he processed the gravity of his actions. I thought I was being tough. I thought I was standing up for myself, but I was wrong. I was just a coward hiding behind my words," he confessed, his voice cracking under the weight of realization. Jonas nodded slowly, the corners of his mouth turning slightly upward, not quite a smile, but a recognition of the moment's significance. "Acknowledgement is the first step toward change, Ricardo. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong, especially when it comes to beliefs that have been ingrained in us." The air felt charged with a new energy, a tentative bridge being formed between two vastly different worlds. Ricardo's bravado had been stripped away, leaving a young man grappling with his own biases. He looked at Jonas, really looked at him for the first time, and saw not just a man of color but a fellow human being who had once risked everything for his family. "I don't want to be like this anymore," Ricardo said, his voice barely above a whisper, filled with genuine remorse. "I want to understand. I want to learn." "Then let's talk," Jonas suggested, his demeanor softening. "Let's break down these walls one conversation at a time. It won't happen overnight, but it's a start." With the police officer standing by, offering a silent endorsement of this unexpected dialogue, the two men began to open up about their lives. Jonas shared stories of his upbringing, the challenges he faced as a black man in America, and the sacrifices made during his military career. Ricardo listened, absorbing every word, the truth of Jonas's experiences hitting home in ways he hadn't anticipated. "I never thought about it like that," Ricardo admitted, his voice tinged with vulnerability. "I just saw what I wanted to see." "And that's the problem," Jonas replied. "We all have our blind spots. It's what we do when we're confronted with them that counts." As the conversation deepened, the officer stepped back slightly, allowing the two men to engage without interruption. She could sense the tension easing, a flicker of understanding igniting between them. It was a rare moment, two souls, once divided by hatred and misunderstanding, now finding common ground in shared humanity. Yet, the path to redemption was still shrouded in uncertainty. Ricardo had taken the first step, but the journey ahead would be fraught with challenges. Would he be able to truly change his ways, or would he falter under the weight of his upbringing? As they spoke, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows that seemed to mirror the complexities of their conversation. A journey begun, yet far from complete. Ricardo's face was a canvas of confusion and shame as he stared at Jonas, the realization of their connection dawning on him like a storm cloud rolling in. The bravado that had characterized his demeanor just moments before was now replaced by a sense of vulnerability. I didn't know," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know it was you." Jonas observed him, his heart heavy but not unkind. "It's never too late to change, Ricardo," he said, his tone steady and reassuring. "You've got a chance to grow from this. We all do." The words hung in the air, a bridge of empathy stretching between them. Ricardo swallowed hard, the weight of his previous accusations crashing down on him. "I said things I can't take back," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I didn't see you as a person. I just saw what I wanted to see." He looked down at his hands, fists clenched tightly in his lap. "I thought I was better than that." Jonas leaned slightly forward, intrigued by the shift in Ricardo's attitude. "What changed? Why do you think you felt that way?" His question was gentle, inviting rather than confrontational. Ricardo took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling unevenly. "I grew up in a bubble," he confessed. "My family? They never talked about race, but they raised me to think that people like you were the enemy. I guess I just accepted it. I wanted to fit in." He paused, searching for the right words. "But now, it feels wrong. I can see the harm in it." Jonas nodded, a flicker of understanding igniting in his eyes. "It's hard to break out of the box we're put in," he replied. "But realizing it is the first step. You have to work to unlearn those prejudices." There was a warmth in Jonas's voice, a subtle encouragement that made Ricardo feel less isolated in his shame. "I want to," Ricardo said earnestly, his eyes lifting to meet Jonas's gaze. "I really do. I want to understand and to make things right. But how? Where do I even start?" His desperation was palpable, and for the first time, he looked vulnerable, stripped of the armor that had once protected his ignorance. "We start by having conversations like this," Jonas encouraged, his expression softening. "It's about listening, really listening, learning from each other's experiences. You need to talk to people you've hurt and try to understand their pain." He shifted slightly, leaning back against his seat, allowing the weight of his words to settle between them. "It won't be easy, but it's necessary." Ricardo nodded slowly, the gravity of the moment settling in. "I want to do that. I want to be better." His voice trembled slightly, but there was a newfound determination in his eyes. "How can I help? What can I do?" "Start by educating yourself," Jonas replied, feeling a flicker of hope. "Read books, listen to voices that challenge your views, and engage with your community. Show up for people who are fighting for justice." Just as they began to delve deeper into their discussion, a commotion outside pulled their attention. The sound of footsteps and raised voices interrupted their moment. Another police officer arrived on the scene, his demeanor all business as he approached the vehicle. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his eyes darting between Jonas and Ricardo, assessing the situation. The tension in the air shifted again, returning the focus to the incident that had brought them together in the first place. Jonas took a deep breath, glancing at Ricardo, who now appeared small and uncertain. "We were just talking," Jonas said, his voice calm. "He's beginning to see things differently." The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "You called the police, didn't you?" He directed his question at Ricardo, who flinched under the scrutiny. Ricardo nodded, the shame returning as he looked down at his lap again. I did," he admitted, "but I didn't mean it. I was wrong." The officer crossed his arms, waiting for more explanation, the tension thickening in the air. Jonas felt a surge of protectiveness for Ricardo, realizing the young man was at the brink of a significant transformation. But he also understood that the situation had to be addressed properly, and they needed to tread carefully. "Ricardo is learning," Jonas interjected, his voice firm yet measured. "And I believe he deserves a chance to make amends. We all have a path to redemption." The officer regarded Jonas for a moment, weighing his words. The atmosphere was charged, and the outcome of this encounter remained uncertain. As the police began sorting out the chaotic situation, a bystander emerged from the crowd that had gathered, her face flushed with concern. She was a middle-aged woman, her voice trembling slightly as she approached the officers. "Excuse me. I saw everything," she said, her eyes darting between Jonas and Ricardo, both men still reeling from the recent turn of events. The officer who had recognized Jonas, Officer Harris, turned to the woman. "What do you mean you saw everything?" she asked, her authoritative tone cutting through the tension. "I was walking my dog when I saw this young man screaming and pointing at the driver," the woman explained, gesturing toward Ricardo. "I thought something terrible was happening, but then I heard him yell, calling him a kidnapper. I couldn't believe it. I've seen that man before. He's a local hero." Jonas shifted uncomfortably in his seat as the woman's words echoed in his mind. He hadn't thought of himself as a hero for years, especially not after the accident that had changed his life. But now, as the bystander recounted the story of his past bravery, he felt a flicker of that old fire reigniting within him. "Listen," said Officer Harris, her gaze now fixed on Ricardo, who was growing increasingly agitated. "This is serious. You can't just call the police and make false accusations. Do you understand the gravity of what you've done?" Ricardo's bravado began to crumble under the weight of the situation. "I was scared," he protested weakly, his voice breaking. "I thought..." "Thought what?" Officer Harris interrupted, her patience wearing thin. "That you could scream kidnapper and get away with it? We're going to need to take your account into consideration because this isn't just about you being scared. You've made a serious allegation against a man who has fought for his country." The bystander nodded, stepping closer. "I've seen him around. He's not a threat. I know him. I know what he did. He saved that woman's life." She turned her attention back to Ricardo, who was now looking anywhere but into her eyes. "You should be ashamed of yourself." Ricardo's cheeks flushed as he processed the gravity of his actions. I didn't know who he was," he murmured, as if trying to convince himself more than anyone else. "Exactly," Officer Harris replied, her tone softening just a fraction. "You didn't bother to find out. You let your fear and your prejudice get the better of you." Jonas sat in silence, absorbing the words exchanged around him. The atmosphere had shifted. The tension was still there, but it was laced with a burgeoning understanding. Officer Harris turned to him, her expression unreadable. "I'm going to file a report. We'll be pressing charges for false reporting and harassment." "You deserve justice, Jonas." Jonas finally found his voice. "I appreciate that, officer. But I think there's more to this than just charges. He needs to understand what he's done." Ricardo looked up, desperation pooling in his eyes. "What can I do?" he pleaded, his voice quavering. I want to change. I don't want to be like this. Please help me." Jonas took a deep breath, contemplating the gravity of the moment. "It's about more than just saying sorry, Ricardo. It's about understanding why your words matter. You need to confront your beliefs, see people for who they are, not their skin color." "I want to help," Ricardo said, his voice stronger now, filled with a newfound urgency. "I want to volunteer. I want to do something good. Please, let me make amends." Officer Harris watched the exchange closely, nodding slowly as if she had seen something transformative unfold before her eyes. "That's a start," she said, "but it will take more than just volunteering. It's about education, empathy, and listening." As the officers wrapped up their investigation, Jonas found himself looking at Ricardo, not with anger or disdain, but with something akin to compassion. "If you're serious about this," he said, meeting Ricardo's gaze, "I could use some help at a community center I volunteer at. We're always looking for people willing to learn and engage in tough conversations." Ricardo's face lit up with hope. "I'll do it. I promise." The conversation shifted from accusations to a shared goal, a tentative bridge forming between them. As they exchanged contact information, Jonas felt a sense of closure he hadn't anticipated. Maybe redemption wasn't just about one person atoning for their sins, but about creating a ripple effect of understanding and growth. In the aftermath of the encounter, Jonas received a commendation for his bravery, a recognition that felt different this time. It wasn't just a nod to his past, but a testament to the path forward, a chance for healing, not just for him, but for Ricardo as well. They were both on a journey, and as they stepped into their new roles, the possibilities for change began to unfurl like a blossoming flower, vibrant and full of promise. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and watch this next story, which is really exciting.